Welcome to this edition of Public Affairs, Public Access, brought to you by the League of Women Voters Education Fund in conjunction with Houston Media Source. Tonight, we'll be talking about a very serious issue affecting many around the Houston area and the region. This issue has severely impacted over billions of dollars, affected countless lives, and has resulted in the loss of millions and billions of dollars worth of property. I'm your host, Quentin Wiltz with the League of Women Voters, and this evening we have a panel of great guests here to talk about some of the causes and hopefully to clarify some of the issues involved with Houston flooding. I'll take a moment to introduce some of them, and then we'll get back and introduce some of our topics. So with us tonight we have Dr. John Jacobs with the Texas Coastal Watershed Program. We have Stephen Costello with the City of Houston, and Matt Zeev with Harris County Flood Control District. For viewers at home, if you'd like to participate, the number to reach to call us is 713-807-1794. And at this time, I'd like to swing it over to Dr. Jacobs. If you could, tell us a little bit about your background and currently what you do.
Sure. So it's John Jacob with the Texas Coastal Watershed Program, which is a program of Texas A&M University through two components of the university, the Texas AgriLife Extension Service, the old extension service that people know through the county agents, and then Texas Sea Grant, which is basically the coastal analog of the extension service. I am a soil scientist by training, all 3 degrees in fact. But I guess today I would count myself as a watershed scientist, so a much broader approach, sort of taking a holistic focus on issues of landscape health, urban health, and so flooding is certainly part of what we might consider watershed health.
Okay. And Stephen?
Well, I came here in 1977 from the East Coast working for the Army Corps of Engineers as a civilian, and been focusing on stormwater management for almost 40 years now. Co-founded an engineering company in 1991, became an at-large city council member in 2010, and so was term limited. And mayor's asked me to come back and work for him on particularly on drainage-related issues. They call me the chief resilient officer, but some people call me the flood czar. So it's a good topic for me to be here to talk about.
For sure. And Matt?
Native Houstonian. Graduated from Texas A&M University with a bachelor's and master's in civil engineering, focused on water resources engineering. Spent about 15 and a half years in private consulting, working only on drainage projects. That's all I've ever done. My specialty is called hydrology and hydraulics. And back in November, I joined Harris County Flood Control District as the Chief Operations Officer.
Okay. So thank you all for agreeing to be with us. And so, you pointed out something, Stephen, so we'll start with that. We've had conversations with it. It's an interesting title. You mentioned resilience, but that is not really what we speak about when we talk about floods, because we're inundated with water here in Houston. But kind of elaborate more on your title, the flood czar. People call you that. What exactly does that mean?
Well, initially what the mayor wanted me to focus on were multiple issues. Whether it was flooding, transportation, we were just in the process of talking about where I should focus our attention. And then we had the tax day flood. And the mayor said, well, right now flooding is the #1 issue for our community, and that is your expertise, so that's what I would like to focus on. And so he and I have talked about a number of initiatives that we'd like to do, and I would assume we'll talk about that during the course of the hour. Some of them are long-term. Some of them are more short-term related, so that we can gain the trust of the public, the general public, about how we address flooding. The issue of flooding is one that we will never prevent flooding. What we want to do is make sure we mitigate for it, and we try to protect as many people as we can. And so that's sort of where we are right now. We have long-term goals and short-term goals.
Okay. Now, let's kind of tip it over. You did mention something about you can never prevent it. I've gotten a lot of feedback from people in the Harris County area as well as the surrounding areas. Houston is known as the most diverse city, the energy capital. Should we also add flood capital of the U.S. to that title? And if so, Dr. Jacob, you and I have spoken a bit about it. Can you elaborate a bit about some of those issues regarding the continued flooding and some of the preventive measures. We'll get around to that as well.
Well, flood capital, I don't know if we would be the flood capital, but certainly we're one of the highest users of flood insurance. I think we may be tops in terms of claims, or near tops in terms of claims. So to your point about, and what Mr. Costello said here about not being able to prevent flooding, I think it is important for people to realize that it's always flooded here. There have been floods. There were floods here before anybody was here. In the time of the Karankawa, there were floods. So we have these, we call these floodplains, where the rivers flow, and the rivers would get out of their banks without any impervious surface anywhere, without any kind of development. Those floodplains, those valleys were carved out over many thousands of years. So I think flooding is just part and parcel of who we are. Certainly it's exacerbated by development, there's no question about it. Some of these issues can be mitigated as well, but I think we just need to recognize that this does happen here for sure. We're low-lying, we're flat. We have, I think it's about the highest intensity of rainfall that falls anywhere in the U.S. on the Gulf Coast, if I'm not mistaken. So a fair amount of rainfall, falls very hard, very flat, no natural drainage, or very little natural drainage, so it's going to flood.
So, okay, so we acknowledge the fact that it's going to flood here. There are several different entities, the Harris County Flood Control District, are there to help us kind of cope with some of these issues. And so when people think about the Harris County Flood Control District, right, they think, what are you doing to control the floods? So Matt, if you could, speak to a little bit about what the district does and some of the initiatives that you guys are taking to mitigate some of the flooding.
Well, going back in history, the city of Houston was devastated by floods in 1929 and 1935. And in 1937, the Harris County Flood Control District was formed to be a partner with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to work on large flood damage reduction projects for the area. Primarily, the focus was on protecting downtown Houston, because back in the 30s and 40s, all Houston was downtown Houston. And we're a special purpose district with our boundaries that match the Harris County boundaries, where our purpose is to provide flood damage reduction projects our mission is to provide flood damage reduction projects that work with appropriate regard for community and natural values. That's our mission statement. I've probably said it 1,000 times already, being at the district just for a few months. But so our role has changed over time. We still partner with the Corps of Engineers on very large, multi-million-dollar flood damage reduction projects. Currently, there are projects going on Brays Bayou, Sims Bayou, Greens Bayou, Clear Creek, White Oak Bayou, and Hunting Bayou that we're partnering with the Corps of Engineers on. But we also do our own projects now that are help out certain areas of the county. And then a very, very large part of what we do is maintenance. We have a very large maintenance program. There are over 2,500 miles of streams, bayous, creeks in Harris County. We're responsible for maintaining, primarily mowing. Also, we have over 18,000 acres of detention basins that we maintain. So those are the primary roles that we serve nowadays with the county.
And the funding for these projects are obtained by what means?
Our primary source of funding is property taxes. On your property tax bill, there's a line item for the Harris County Flood Control District. But we also partner with the federal government, so our Corps of Engineers projects there's cost sharing with the federal government. For example, on the Brays Bayou project, it's a 50-50 split is how it's working out, local funds versus federal funding. We also get grants from various sources, either state or federal sources such as FEMA, and we also get grants sometimes from the Texas Water Development Board to do projects. So we have various funding sources.
So just in the last 15 months, we've heard the term 100-year floods, right? And I'll ask Dr. Jacobs to hopefully elaborate a bit on that. But just in the last 15 months, Houston has suffered damage from 3 100-year floods. So first, Dr. Jacobs, could you explain what in fact a 100-year flood is, and also kind of speak to some of the reasons that especially the tax day flood, as to why we were hit with such severity?
Well, the 100-year flood is a construct. It's a concept. It's a statistical
Correct. Okay.
idea. And as one engineer in FEMA suggested to me recently, it's just our best guess of what that flood frequency might be, because we don't have a long-term record. It might only be 50 years, it might be 100 years in some places, but it's certainly not a super long area. So when you see on a map something that says 100-year flood, it might mean within that 100-year floodplain, it could mean that out at the edges, it's basically what that means is a 1% chance. But within that 100-year floodplain, you might have areas that could flood every 10 years, or you might be in a floodway that might flood more often. So it's best to see that as just an area that has a very high chance of flooding. And so we give it this term, we call it the 100%, or the 100-year flood, because it has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. Now, we have seen a lot of floods, but I don't think all of those floods were necessarily in the same watershed every time. So you have to think about that too. So it means if you've got a 100-year floodplain, it means in that particular floodplain. But nonetheless, I mean, we've seen floods in these, especially out in the western side of town. We've seen some floods that have been more often than the 1% chance. So why are they occurring? Well, number one, we've had some extraordinary floods, some extraordinary rainfall. So when you get 17, 18, 19, I guess even 20 inches maybe, even without any vegetation, without any pavement at all, those creeks were going to rise and they were going to flood. I mean, I think we would all agree on that that was just going to flood. So that was totally foreseeable. So the problem comes when people put their houses in places that perhaps they shouldn't put their houses, and then they end up flooding. So when you see a house, people who've got 2, 3, 4 feet flood water in their houses, they're not up on the divide somewhere. They're not out of the floodplain. They are in a low area. This is not a sort of a random happen chance. I seem to get that from the news a lot. Is you could just wake up anywhere and you step out of your bed and there could be 3 or 4 feet of water in your house. That could happen anywhere. But that's absolutely not true. You've got to be down in a floodplain. So I think we've got a history in this town of sort of not respecting the floodplain as much as we should. I think I'm going to make a guess here, but I think most of the damage where we see people, walking chest high out of the floodplain, that these are mainly a legacy, from the past when maybe in the 80s, I don't know that there was really any excuse, but people, tended to say, well, it's, we can build here, land was cheaper, whatever. But I think even now we still tend to push that envelope just a little too much, and we want to get as close as we can down there, and we get right up to either the 100-year, or there's the other next level up is called the 500-year, and that's a 0.2% chance of flooding. That should still be in our brains as this is not a good place to build. This is low on the landscape. Let's move up out of the landscape. People say, well, there's no, if you said stay out of the floodways, out of the 500-year floodplain, there'd be no place to develop in Houston. That's just not true. There's plenty of land up on the high divides. So I think the flooding issue is not that there's a flood problem. The problem is that we've put ourselves in harm's way much too often, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, at this time, I believe we have a caller.
Hello, caller.
Yes, hello.
Yes? You're live?
Yes, hello. Hi, this is Brian. I live in Bel Air. I have a question for you as it relates to Meyerland. It's been hit particularly hard the past couple of years. Can you talk to us about what has caused the impact of the flooding in Meyerland the past couple of years, and what actions, and this is in particular for the gentleman from the flood control district, what actions are being taken to address the flooding for Meyerland?
So thank you, caller. We really do appreciate it. So we'll go to the czar first.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Meyerland. And what the doctor said earlier is the fact that, the flood insurance program didn't really start until the late 70s. And there are a lot of the flood-prone areas, particularly like Meyerland, particularly like the apartment complexes up during the tax day flood up in Greenspoint area, that were constructed prior to the implementation of the flood insurance program. And over the years, we have learned to design accordingly to make sure that when we develop these neighborhoods, that we make sure that we get sheet flow now out of the neighborhood so that we don't build streets that are below the top of banks of bayous. Now in the Meyerland area, that's a classic example of where you have these streets that are below the elevations of the top of the banks of the bayou. And the reason why we had such extreme flooding last year during Memorial Day and this year during tax day had to do with the fact of the type of rainfall we had. Most people don't realize these flood insurance studies assume a general storm over the entire watershed. It looks like a bell curve. The worst type of flood you can have is when you have that bell curve squished and put at the headwaters of the watershed. And that's really what happened on Brays Bayou, was that we had a concentrated rainfall event at the headwaters of the bayou that just swamped overflowed the bayou in the Meyerland area. Now I'll let Matt talk a little bit about what the federal project is and what the district, the local sponsor, is doing on that relative to Brays Bayou.
So definitely, Matt, if you could speak to what the second part of the question is, that what are we doing to mitigate or to prevent, or what projects do we have?
Sure. So the Flood Control District, along with the Corps of Engineers in the Galveston District, are working on Project Brays, is our name for it. You can search on Google, type in Project Brays, and we have an information page that's easily available. It's a $550 million project. We started in 2000, so it's been going on 16 years. We have 5 more years left to go at our current funding levels. Basically, we're building channel improvements on over 21 miles of the bayou. We're putting in large detention basins equivalent to over 300 million gallons of water, and we're modifying over 30 bridges that cross Brays Bayou. So this is a massive project. The Harris County Flood Control District spends around 1/3 of our capital improvement program budget on Brays Bayou every year. We've been successful getting reimbursement from the federal government for the past 8 years. So that cash flow is what keeps the project moving. And folks are saying, well, why does it take, we've heard a lot of questions from the public, why is it taking so long? Why is it taking 16 years? Why is it this, that, and the other? Well, we have to work with what the elected officials up in Washington, D.C. give us to work with, and we do as much as we can every year with the available funds. So not saying the project could be done much quicker if we had more funding at the federal government level, but we do spend quite a bit of money on quite a large percentage of our capital programs budget.
Sure, definitely.
Yeah, Quentin, I'd like to just add to that, and that is true. You know, when I first started my career, the federal to local sponsor split was always 90-10, and now it's 50-50. And it's a reimbursement program to where the Flood Control District spends all the money and then sends a bill and waits for reimbursement. And their residents are also city residents. And what I've tried to explain to the city is the difference between drainage and flooding. And the two agencies have a distinct role. Our role in drainage is to get water from the rooftop to the bayou. And then it's the Flood Control District taking care of flooding that gets it from the bayou to the bay. But since our residents don't see the difference, it's time for the agencies to work together. And so the City of Houston has never been involved in these local projects, these sponsored projects. And so the mayor is actually up in Washington today talking to the elected officials to see if, in fact, if the city will help the local sponsor on their cash flow issue, whether or not we can get reimbursed as well. And so we're beginning to start to work together to help each other. And that's what the city would like to do, is to help the Flood Control District on their cash flow, so that we can expedite some of these projects.
And Dr. Jacobs?
So I have a question for Matt here. So Meyerland, it's not just a drainage problem, right? It is in a low-lying floodplain there, right, along Brays Bayou, and it flooded, as we've talked about before. So even, not to put you on the spot, but even with this massive flood control project, would you tell people that live in the lower-lying areas of Meyerland that their chance of flooding, not drainage, but actual overbank flooding, is gone away? In other words, would you expect that 101% floodplain to reduce, to be gone in Meyerland?
So before you answer that,
Sure.
if you could, tell the viewers I think there's a website, harriscountyfemt.org. Is that it?
Sure, sure. They're www.harriscountyfemt, all one word, .org. And that's a very simple tool to be able to see the current affected floodplains all over Harris County. You can just type in your address in the upper left corner, and it'll zoom right into your house, and you can see whether or not you're in the...
And it's a GIS system, correct?
Correct,
And
that's
so
correct.
you can go, once you go to the website, you can go throughout Harris County, and as you filter down through the different layers, you'll be able to see exactly how far the floodplains extend beyond the bayous and tributaries, correct?
That's right.
Okay, so I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off.
that's all right. And Steve had a great follow-up to what I had to say, and I appreciate that. And then to answer your question, once Project Braze is complete, we will be remapping, updating the flood insurance rate maps for all of the entire Braze Bayou watershed, and the limits of the 1% and the 0.2% floodplains will decrease in much of Braze Bayou. Now, I'll tell folks, some folks will still be inside the new limits of the 100-year floodplain even after the project is complete because of their elevation. And there's, we can make channel improvements, we can build detention basins, but we can't change elevations of homes and of neighborhoods. So some of those people will remain in there. But several thousand structures will be not in the new floodplains.
So
now,
go ahead.
I still recommend that every single person in Harris County buys flood insurance. So I have to say that. We're all at risk for flooding.
I have flood insurance, and I'm not in a floodplain.
Same here.
So when you mentioned some of the existing homes being at such a low level, I think you and I also talked about this earlier, is one of the suggestions was made, well, perhaps we could take the existing infrastructure and lower it to thereby give the houses an elevated presence to then drain. And
Sure. What you're referring to is most subdivisions built in the late 80s, early 90s, and from that point on, were built with the streets cut a little bit lower, and then the spoil from the street cuts going to build the houses up higher. So, and essentially, the street systems function as the emergency overflow areas for large storm events that the storm sewers can't handle. Older neighborhoods, such as Meyerland, that were built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, a lot of them weren't built in that fashion just because that's just not the style of engineering or what was common back in that time. So to go back and retrofit some of those older neighborhoods by lowering the streets, it's not impossible, but the cost associated with it is extremely high because once you lower the streets, then you have to redesign and rebuild all the storm sewer systems. You might have other utilities such as water lines and sewer lines that have to be adjusted, which can get very pricey. And then you have to think about the connection to all the other streets serving the neighborhood and make sure all those grades and everything else works out. So not saying it's impossible, it's just a costly proposition.
And so, 1 second, we do have a caller. Yes.
Yes, my name is Angela, and I live in Spring Branch. Our neighborhood was built in the 1950s, and in the past few years, the city has put out these grant programs. I believe it's called like flood mitigation or hazard mitigation to try to help homeowners elevate their homes since they don't have any other options. Is the city going to continue promoting these programs and making them available to the public?
Angela, thank you for the question. We actually have recently received a little over $16.5 million for that particular program, which is to help people raise their houses. The problem is that the number of requests, because it's by request, far exceeds the amount of dollars that we have. And in some cases, it's difficult to even be cost effective in raising houses, but in certain areas we're doing that. I do know that there are a number of houses in Spring Branch that have applied for that particular program. The other thing that I'm going to be focusing on at the mayor's request is making sure that in some of these areas, particularly up in Spring Branch in the older parts of the areas, to make sure that the infrastructure is working properly. Because I know that you said that that's your only option, but we need to make sure that that is your only option. If we can improve the infrastructure and not have to raise a house, that's going to be our primary goal.
So one of the things that we talked about, obviously, throughout is cost. Is it cost prohibitive? Where do you get the funding? and most of the projects are funded by ad valorem or property taxes, correct? Yes.
Oh, you asking
I'm
us
asking the question now.
Oh,
Or just-
well, their budget, true, is primarily through property taxes, and whether they get federal funding grants or from state funding grants. City of Houston's the same way. Actually, our Rebuild Houston program is a combination of revenue from tax ad valorem taxes as well as a drainage user fee. And then we also pursue other funding sources, whether it's through FEMA or whether it's through the Water Development Board. So we're all looking for those dollars.
And you mentioned Rebuild Houston, right? If you could you elaborate a little bit about what that is? Some of the viewers may not be familiar with Rebuild Houston, so if you can talk to that.
Rebuild Houston was an initiative that was passed in 2010. It was primarily a drainage and street program. The infrastructure of the city of Houston is declining and decaying, and so over 60% of the infrastructure is beyond its useful life. So it's designed to improve and replace the existing infrastructure over time. It has a sunsetted program. It's a 20-year program. It's sunsetted in year 19. And if it gets approved by council, it can roll over for another 20 years. It has 4 sources of money. One of them is a drainage user fee that's on everybody's water bill. Raises a little over $120 million. Then we have a developer impact fee. We also have what we call third-party money, which is we get 25% of the 1 penny sales tax rebate from Metro, and we use that for mobility purposes. So that goes into the fund as well. And then what we did was we allocated 11.8 cents of our property taxes to pay off existing street and drainage debt. We put the debt in there and we put the revenue in there. So it's a combination of 4 sources of money. So right now it generates probably around $250 million a year. By the time we start paying off the debt in maybe year 15, it'll be generating 4 times that. So it's a program that's going to grow pretty quickly over the next few years. And so we're real excited about that.
So, and one of the things that I noticed about the funding is that half of the funding to Rebuild Houston is property taxes. Well, if Houston continues to flood, how do you intend to capitalize on getting the funding if
Well,
you're affecting this major source of contribution?
We have multiple challenges on property taxes. Obviously, the mayor's been pretty vocal about our the cap on our taxes, the property tax rate. And so when I was first on council, our tax rate was 66 cents. Now it's 60 cents. So it's on its way. It's declining down because of the property tax cap. The 11.8 cents of the total property taxes is used to pay off the debt. And then as the debt's paid off, just like your mortgage, any excess we have, we put it into capital projects. So it's a pay-as-you-go program.
Sure.
Whereas historically, if you look back maybe 20 or 30 years, the city has historically sold bonds to do infrastructure improvements. And on average, it was about $100 million a year. Well, we're already doing 2.5 times that now with this particular program. We'll probably do 4 or 5 times that over the next few years. So it's a different way of doing infrastructure. Obviously, we felt the pain initially when we converted to pay-as-you-go, but now we're beginning to realize the benefit of that financial model.
And so I just want to clarify, when you say pay-as-you-go, you mean that you collect all the funding, and until the funding actually reaches the amount that you would choose to complete these projects, that's when you use the funds, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. So I just wanted to clarify that.
We do no more borrowing for streets and drainage. We just do it as a pay-as-you-go program.
Sure. And I believe we have another caller.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm calling about the infrastructure of Allen Parkway and through the downtown area and through Kirby Memorial and Brays Bayou. Now, one thing I want to say about on 288, because they did a drainage, they put a big pump on the across from Grocery Supply. What the problem is, with 288 infrastructure that runs the Brays, when the Brays Bayou run over that overpass, that was never supposed to happen. The bridge, for one thing, is built too low. and nobody has complained about that. Anytime you build a bridge, infrastructure like that, the bridge is supposed to come over. It's supposed to be an overflow. An overhill. That when the water flows, it won't affect the expressway.
Okay, so there's multiple parts I think you
Sure.
can probably address, and we really
the bridge elevation.
thank you for the call. So, you know, some of the things.
And the drainages are too short. When the water flows into the drainage, the old drainage system, they're about 2 blocks long before it goes into the drainage system. So they did the infrastructure that was built, that they put there back in the 1900s. They need to correct that, because they do it in the subdivision. It shouldn't go all the way to the block. It should be one at the end of the block and one in the middle of the block.
Okay.
So the surveyors, when the surveyors did whatever the surveyors did when they did that, you don't have very many surveyors coming out with blueprints to find out what the real infrastructure is. They just look like they just going by their head.
So you've left us with several issues, and we'll try to address those. So we really do appreciate the call. So.
All right. I mean, the architecture and long years ago it was the Army engineers that laid the plan. Now they bringing out these new architects and new designers and new everybody. But if to keep the thing from the streets from flooding, some of that ground needs to be lifted where it can run off.
So.
It can run off just like a mountain, just like you're on a mountain.
So let us give us a chance to at least give them an opportunity to address some of these concerns. They're all great concerns. We appreciate the questions. So, Allen Parkway, 288, Brays Bayou.
Yeah.
And so if you could speak to those,
Bayou
Matt.
hadn't flooded like that in 40 years.
So, Matt, could you speak to some of the projects on Brays Bayou, for
Well,
instance?
sure. Well, all new bridges, basically since the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
Our criteria for new bridges, you have to have the low chord, the bottom of the bridge, 18 inches or a foot above the 100-year water surface elevation.
Well, they should change that data. They should change that data, because that water is not supposed to go over the bridge. It is not. Then in 1980 and 1984, that's when it happened.
Okay.
In 1984-85, that's when that first flood, and the contractors came out there and put that big pump. That's as you go down the exit where that lady got drowned. They come down there, they put that large pump up there. So I don't know if they redirect the water or they open up those shafts that's underground, that's underneath that bayou, that they open them shafts up.
Okay, so can you talk to us about some of the blueprints or some of the issues that I think she's addressing, and some of the infrastructure being put in? Could you continue to speak to that?
Sure. So new infrastructure is set to a certain criteria. Bridges especially have to be above the 100-year flood, the entire bridge. Most new bridges all new bridges meet that criteria. Some of the older bridges, I'm not sure when the 288 bridge was constructed, but maybe that criteria wasn't in place. We generally, on the major freeways, 288, 59, I-45, I-10, TxDOT owns those bridges. They're responsible for designing those bridges, but their criteria is similar, if not the same, as local Harris County criteria when it comes to major freeway bridges. Now, the pump station you saw was also designed by TxDOT to drain an underpass. There are pump stations all over Houston, Harris County. Most people probably don't even know what they are, except my wife, because I point them out every time we drive down the freeway. But there's lots of underpasses around, and those pump stations are generally designed for the 50-year or 2% flood event to handle that much water that goes into an underpass. Your other question about, I believe what you're referring to are storm sewer inlets in the neighborhoods, and you're right. Now, the Harris County Flood Control District doesn't handle neighborhood drainage. That's, as Mr. Costello said, that's generally the city's responsibility, or if you don't live inside the city of Houston, you might live inside unincorporated Harris County and be served by a municipal utility district, and that's their responsibility. But earlier criteria, you're exactly right. The inlets were smaller. They were spaced further apart. And criteria has changed and gotten better over time as we learn more about how drainage works in our area.
Yeah. Just to talk a little bit about the underpass issue, Judge Emmett had a sort of like a summit yesterday that I attended with all of the local agencies, with TxDOT, Harris County Flood Control District, Harris County, City of Houston, Metro, to specifically talk about these ungated underpasses where people are drowning. And so we are all on the same wavelength in terms of talking about how we prevent people during these extreme rainfall events from driving into these underpasses and drowning. So I want the caller to be assured that all the agencies are now collectively working together to solve some of these problems. And it could be, if you go back to look at some of these bridges, I call it a ruler. They have this little staff gauge on the side of the embankment, but when it's raining out and it's late at night, you don't see it. So you're going to be seeing a lot of changes, particularly on the city side, that I know the county and TxDOT are also working on, to where we're going to see more visual lighting and possibly some type of gating structures to prevent people from driving through these intersections during heavy rains.
Sure. No, and you know, to kind of get back to what we were talking about earlier with regard to Rebuild Houston, you know, some would argue that the program is not working. And so as the mayor transitioned, he got some recommendations from his transition team about the need for major change. Could you perhaps talk to maybe some of the things that were not implemented?
Well, I was actually part of the transition team and sat through some of that particular transition team's meetings. A lot of the issue has to do with the fact that when Public Works does a project, they're very large projects, and yet we have problems everywhere in the city. And so the primary recommendation from the committee was break these projects up into smaller projects and touch more people, and go out into these areas and do smaller projects so that you're impacting more people, so that people can appreciate the program. A lot of it has to do with the lack of communication between the city and the general public. And sometimes I fault our profession for that. No disrespect to us, but we're problem solvers. We're not the best communicators. And so we need to do a better job of communicating what we're trying to accomplish. And we need to do a better job of asking the public, well, what do you think the solution is? And say, well, we'll take some time to evaluate solution, whether or not it's going to be valid or not, but at least give them an opportunity to air their concerns. That was one thing. The other is that we have an oversight committee that the former mayor had created, and there needs to be a better reaction between the Oversight Committee and Public Works, because really that group is just there to make some recommendations and to sort of air the concerns of the public. So I think that's the primary two issues, is touching more people with smaller projects and then getting better communication out to the public.
Okay, and then I've got a question for you, Dr. Jacobs. So with development, you know, we talked about this a little bit earlier as well, with almost, 6 million people moving to this region, well, over the course of so many years, right? So 4 million, 6 million after a while.
Give or take.
Give or take, right? So there's an added density, and due to the population, there's construction of several different developments, and with that you have increased coverage of concrete. And we talk about permeable and impermeable surfaces. So if you could kind of speak to that, and that as a contributing factor to some of the flooding that we've seen.
Yeah, so that's basic watershed science, right? You know, a healthy watershed has plenty of area where water can seep into the soil, and as it seeps into the soil, then it's cleaned, it's cleansed. You know, we don't get such spiky flows. You know, the base flow comes into the creek slowly. So that's how a watershed is designed to work. And then we come along, and because we don't want to have water in our houses, then we have to put pavement down, and we have to put drains in. And so we want, where we live, we want that water to run off very quickly and make its way down the bayou. But then that is basically an insult to the ecology of the watershed and the health of the watershed. So it's a trade-off, right? We're going to live here. There's no question about it. I'm not moving away. I love Houston. I'm staying here. So I realize that I have an impact. But we need to think about this on a large watershed scale, because as we develop, we're moving out into areas that serve as important, we could call them sponges even. You know, out onto Katy Prairie, other prairies that we don't normally name, like the Damon Prairie and other prairies. Flood control has done some great work on this, in fact, out in the Katy Prairie, looking at prairies where they have the deep-rooted grasses, even though those are very tight soils and don't, at least in their disturbed condition, don't tend to get a lot of water in. When you've got those deep grasses on there, that water goes in quite a bit more. And then out there on the prairie, we have all kinds of these depressional features out there. We call them prairie potholes, and those hold a certain amount of water too. So when we develop, we tend to get rid of all that, and we have to pay the price, and that water comes streaming down, and that would certainly add to the flooding. I'm not going to say that, if you're, like we said before, if you've got a 20-inch rain, you're going to flood regardless. Now, what does development do? Maybe it adds, maybe it adds a little bit, adds half a foot or a foot, hard to say. Certainly we try to mitigate. We put in detention basins, we put in conveyance systems to make up for that. But even there, my understanding is we only design for about a 100-year, not even a 100-year flood, maybe a 50-year flood. Is that correct?
Well, on the development side, and just for open records, I mean, I made a living out of developing projects, and so what the general public can't appreciate is the fact, and I'll do it visually. So let's say this is the existing flooding problem, and the development comes in and they add more runoff. This is here. Well, the local regulatory requirement is you do no more harm, so they really just mitigate for their impact, and yet this impact still exists, and it's really up to the local agencies to solve this problem. And we haven't been doing that for lack of funding. And so we need to do a better job of figuring out, okay, we should be participating with the development to solve some of these problems or to share some of the burden.
Yeah.
So would you say that the developers exploit some of the loopholes?
I wouldn't say they exploit. I would say that they follow the rules. And the issue is if you want to get them to participate, you're going to have to change the rules. And the public now is demanding that. And so one of my jobs that the mayor has asked is that we're going to be evaluating some of that criteria moving forward. And so we'll be having those discussions.
So when they come in and develop, I believe the term is hydraulic deficiency. Is that correct?
Well, we recently changed the criteria. Previously, all they did was mitigate for their impact relative to increase in runoff, but that was associated with change in impervious cover. Now, but if, let's say something's fully developed, and a developer comes in, scrapes it all up, and changes the hydraulic efficiency of the site, where there's less ponding or bigger pipes, then indeed he has to mitigate now for that, where before he didn't ever have to do that. And that's only recently. And it's not that big of a mitigation impact. So, I mean, we need to take a global look at our entire criteria to evaluate what impact it's having on development.
And Dr. Jacobs, I apologize.
Sure. No, well, I think, if I got your hand signals there, right, we've got, the natural flooding, and then development brings a certain amount more. Certainly you want to mitigate that, but even that part is only mitigated up to a certain % flood, right?
Well,
it's not going to do a 17.
Years ago, we used to just mitigate for the 100-year event. Now the local criteria is that you do what is called in a range of floods. So you look at the 2, the 5, the 10. There's multiple floods that we'll look at to make sure, because of the problem is that a lot of the ditches that flood control owns and operates and maintains do not have a 100-year capacity. Right. They have either 2-year or 5-year or 10-year. So what we're seeing now, and we're all getting smarter about this. I mean, this is not exact science. It's more of an art over time. What we're now seeing is okay, if the outfall only has this much capacity, then we're only going to discharge to that capacity.
Sure.
So we're changing over time.
Yeah. So I guess my point was, I mean, there's, with the natural flood capacity that's out there already, I think we may over-rely somewhat possibly on engineering solutions when maybe we ought to at least consider sort of, expanding our buffer from the floodplain and not move in so close, because I think sometimes we think, well, let's add that extra row of houses or let's get down. So, for example, in the recent flooding, I guess as part of the whole tax day complex, since there was more than one day, but there was one neighborhood, I think it was called Stable Gate or something like that, and the people complained in the newspaper, and I was able to actually look them up. And they were actually right close. They were outside the floodplain, where the drawn floodplain. They were even outside the 500-year floodplain, but just barely. just maybe, you know, in elevation-wise, maybe just a foot or two. So I think it would be prudent for us, if we were to act prudently, to give a little wider berth to these natural systems, you know, and not try to push that envelope quite so much, because we can only engineer, you know, so much our way out of these things. And so I think to give ourselves a little broader berth there, and to start thinking about those outer lying areas. I mean, this gets into property issues and whatnot, but those areas are essentially a form of flood control. You know, we're not, if we drain them and bring all that water down, it's got to go somewhere. And right now it's seeping in slowly. There's the depressions, and we don't, by the way, we don't mitigate for the depressional volume of the prairie potholes. We mitigate for the lost soil capacity. You know, water can't get in, but not for the potholes, which could cover 30% of an undisturbed area, and could account for easily, you know, they could be a foot deep. So
yeah, but we do that on the development side, because, you know, some of the older developments had depressions in the pavement, and so when they come in and regrade that and redevelop it, then they're changing hydraulic efficiency.
Well, no, I'm talking about the natural
You're
potholes.
talking about natural potholes.
Yeah, the word potholes is problematic. So I'm talking about natural prairie depressions out on the landscape. I don't know if that was a.
No, that's okay.
I shouldn't have used that word.
We talk a lot about development concrete, and I know with the Harris County Flood Control District, some people have the perception that all you do is concrete the bayous, right? Would you be able to speak to that a bit?
Well, in the 40s and 50s, it was all about efficiency of conveyance. And the most efficient way to move water is a hydraulic efficient section that has a low coefficient of friction for the water, and generally that's concrete. That was the way to go in the 50s and 60s and 70s, which you'll folks along Brays Bayou, Sims Bayou, portions of White Oak Bayou, you can see that they were portions of Vince Bayou were concrete lined, and the reason was to move the water out to the bay as fast as possible. Over time, as we've learned more about ecosystems and the environment and become more environmentally conscious, we don't concrete line bayous anymore. From time to time, there are some of our channels that were concrete lined, and the concrete lining has failed. It's ended its useful life. We'll replace that to maintain the same level of flood protection that was there originally. But very rarely, if ever, will we add concrete to our concrete line a channel anymore.
You know, and a great example we ought to point to in our past was Buffalo Bayou itself, which was on its way towards becoming a White Oak Bayou. But because of Terry Hershey, one of our leading environmentalists, and George Bush #1, they came together and were able to stop that concrete line. And it's still somewhat channelized, but it's a great example of what we might call green infrastructure. So when you flood that whole basin there, you know, from Memorial across to Allen, it's a flood, but it's not hurting anybody. And I think that's the paradigm we want to see, is you've got things flood, they flood without any problem, and it's one of our iconic spaces in the city, right?
Yeah. So you briefly, Quentin, you briefly touched on impervious pavement.
Sure.
But to get back to the ecosystem, there's now a move afoot in development to develop your projects as low impact development type projects. And so what that means is that under natural conditions, the water runs off at a certain shape over time. And so the idea is to, rather than develop it the way we normally do, where it peaks and then you put a detention pond in, is to possibly try to emulate what it would do under natural conditions. And so we have tools in our toolbox now under our design criteria to allow on smaller scale projects to do these, what we call either cisterns, porous pavement, swales, bayou garden, rain gardens. So we're looking differently at the development. Obviously, you can't retrofit a fully developed watershed as it is today, like it is in Brays Bayou, but moving forward, you're seeing a lot more of that happening, where we're doing more and more in terms of trying to get back to the ecosystem type of design.
So my shop puts a lot of those into place, but I do think we should point out a caution. You know, there's basically two types of flooding that we should just very briefly. There's street flooding and there's overbank flooding. And so these low impact development concepts or green stormwater infrastructure are important, but I don't think they're enough to really impact the overbank flooding.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
And in fact, those low impact development criteria were originally developed for water quality purposes.
Right.
Because as the doctor said earlier, with concrete, that first flush is you have a lot of bad material in the runoff. And so this low impact development criteria that on a smaller scale will sort of filter that type of water. And that's another issue. I mean, it's not just flooding, but you're right. The streets are designed to carry the water.
Yeah,
most
it's
of the
important for us, but it's not going to solve, I think, what is rises high in most people's imagination, and that's the overbank flood.
So, and you know, we're kind of tailing off, and I would definitely want to address some additional concerns. And you know, I think it was just recently, a couple days ago, the water levels from a few days ago have just recently subsided back to their normal levels are below, and you have many people, especially in the Greens Point area, West Houston, that are still coming to terms with what happened. And a lot of people want to know, well, what do we do now? So we just expect to be flooded again? Because, again, this occurred before hurricane season. We've not had a hurricane yet, and it's expected that we should see maybe 10 to 15, and we don't know how many will hit this area. So one thing I really do, while we have the gathering of the minds, is to really put maybe some calm behind some people to say, well, look, I still live in these areas. I can't move anywhere else, right? So what am I to expect, and what is being done by the city or what's being done by the district?
Well, I'll jump in the same. Like I said, if you give me the microphone, I'll talk forever.
Oh, for sure.
Relative to the city, we want to help our local sponsor on their federal projects. We want to expedite those projects as best we can. That's what we're going to try and do. Relative to some of the areas that are really flood prone, we're going to be exploring ideas in terms of elevation. We're going to be exploring ideas in terms of buyout. You know, we just received notice that we're getting a little over $66 million from HUD for what they call disaster relief. The problem with that is, and that's a result of last Memorial Day, the problem is that you have to use it in the areas where it flooded. And so the people from tax day, any money we get from HUD will be next year. So we're still going to be mapping out strategies to address some of those issues, particularly the flood-prone areas, the ones that where development occurred prior to the flood insurance program. I mean, up in Greens Point in particular, those apartment complexes, some of them were built before the mapping came out. The first time the maps came out, they were in the floodplain. The second time the maps came out, they were in the floodway. See what I'm saying? So things have changed over time. And so we need to look at that and say, well, is that the right thing to do? Maybe we should buy it out, and maybe we should create green space. So we're going to be looking at all sorts of alternatives. What I am going to be looking at is as flood control finishes their federal projects, I'm going to focus on those areas that might remain in the floodplain and see where the city can fix those problems.
Matt?
So to point out, in Greens Point on Greens Bayou, the Corps of Engineers is currently working on around 3.4 miles of channel improvements just upstream of Greens Bayou. Also, we're in the process of our largest ever capital improvement project, $63 million detention basin project. It's actually 2 detention basins, but they're very close to one another on Greens Bayou to provide a large amount of detention storage in the middle reach, just downstream of upstream of Greens Point, but downstream of the Champions area on Greens Bayou. So, and we're also working on several 3 other smaller basins on Greens Bayou. So there's a lot of projects, a lot of work coming on in the Greens Bayou watershed as we speak. But we try to focus where we can get the most bang for our buck on our projects. We're responsible for, Harris County is huge. If you take unincorporated Harris County, the population almost matches the city of Houston. So we have a large area to cover, and we try to pick projects and focus where we can help the most people at one time.
And one other thing, I know we talked about it at the beginning of the segment, that the mayor currently is in Washington to pretty much ask them for assistance and propose projects. One of those projects is, I think, Lake Houston, correct?
Well, I'm not totally sure about the Lake Houston issue, but you know, over in Lake Houston area, we did have some residual flooding, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that I'm not quite sure how the dam has been operating when those floods and how to predict them. But the other is, I know Councilmember Martin is with the mayor, more concerned about the buildup of sediment.
Correct.
in the lake,
Yep.
and it's reducing the storage capacity of the lake. And so I think they're there to talk about those challenges and if there's a way to get federal funding to help us sort of dredge out the lake and look at those particular issues.
So once the areas are developed, let's say we're beginning new developments, should we require post-testing for these developments? Matt?
Well, generally, when new developments come in and they're reviewed by our watershed management department, they're reviewed to make sure that they meet our criteria, which is mitigation for the 100-year storm within a detention basin most of the time. So when engineers sign and seal plans and they meet our criteria, we take them at their professional word that they're going to construct what's on those plans. So we don't go back and check every single development as it's built. We rely on the engineering community and their professional responsibility to make sure that projects get built as they're designed.
So something else you talked about being, an engineer, right? It's problem solving, it's technical know-how, but do you feel like there's enough being done with communication to the public to give them a sense of calm to know what's going down the pike? Because you just mentioned Greens Point, they won't see anything till a year from now, correct?
More than likely, it's going to take us a little while to get money up there to figure out what we need to get done up there. There is a management district that's actively working up there as well, so it could be a lot sooner than that. Relative to public awareness, I mean, we all have challenges with public awareness, whether it's the city, whether it's the county, whether it's any other agency. We need to do a better job of reaching out to the public, and we need to do a better job of telling them why we're doing things and what the impacts are going to be. So I look forward to both agencies that are involved in drainage and flooding to start working on how we reach out. A lot of people don't get on the webpage. And so there's got to be multiple ways to reach the public. It's not just getting on your computer. And so we've got to figure out how we do that.
And I think
One
in
little
terms of
bit.
the public, we've got to realize that some of these issues just can't be fixed, that some things are just so deep in the floodplain, so far in the floodplain, that you've just got to expect that flooding is going to come back. So that's just a given in our area, and certainly buyouts, it's difficult. People don't want to leave.
Right.
But there's some things we cannot engineer our way out of.
Okay. Well, it's been very informative, to say the least. I really do want to thank each one of you for participating. Dr. Jacobs, Stephen Costello, and Matt Zeev. Thank you all for coming on, and thank you for tuning in, and to the viewers at home who called in with the questions. We really do appreciate it. Again, on behalf of the League of Women Voters Education Fund and Houston Media Source, I want to thank you for tuning in to this edition of Public Affairs Public Access.